This is Wayne at RealFixesRealFast.com. We're working on a 94 Olds Bravada. It's got a 4.3 engine in it. And the complaint is it runs really bad at idle. Doesn't run too bad off idle at cruise speeds, but it just runs real rough at idle. Now in addition, we had the symptoms that the engine was just kind of chugging with some black smoke coming out the tailpipe, and it was just really running bad. Very common of a very rich engine condition. Now if you've worked on very many 4.3s, you know they're what they call central port fuel injection, or what we commonly call the little spider unit that's down underneath the intake. And oftentimes that can leak. Well, that was our first suspicion, but we just didn't want to take that intake off until we actually had some evidence that's what it was. So we went to the scanner, and there were no codes, but we looked at the data. We could see that at idle, the oxygen sensors were reporting a very rich condition. At idle, the oxygen sensors were showing about 900 millivolts, or they're what we call pegged around 900, and it was just staying there. Now when we would accelerate it and get up to cruise speeds, then the oxygen sensors would start switching. We looked at the fuel trim data, and it was showing a value of 80. Now if you're familiar with this, you know 128 is normal. Anything above 128, and the computer is adding fuel. Anything below 128, and it is pulling fuel away. So this was stuck at 80, or level at 80. So it was pulling all the fuel it could away. And yet at cruise speeds, the computer was handling it, and the O2 was switching. But at idle, it was pegged at 900 on the O2, so the computer was not able to handle it at idle. So we had enough indications that it was running rich, and on central port fuel injection, that means to actually get the evidence, we're going to have to pull the intake off and take a look. Now we've hooked into the fuel port, and you can see our fuel pressure. It's right now about 50. We turned the key on a few minutes ago and it's around 57. So we've got good fuel pressure and it's holding. Now quite often when you take this intake off, it very commonly will leak around these tubes. The fuel comes here in the back, goes through here, and these are hard brittle plastic tubes. Very commonly there'll be a crack in here. And when you look, you can actually see like a spot where it's washed clean. Now this is the intake, and if you look down in here, you can see we've actually got some pooling of fuel down in the lower portions, and some down here. That fuel shouldn't be there, so it's an indication that it's leaking somewhere. Quite often too, you'll see the fuel pressure regulator just dripping down, and if that were the case right down here, it would be kind of washed clean. You'd have quite a bit of fuel down in there. Now you can see we've actually even pulled the poppets out. We pulled the poppets out with the key on so that there's pressure. We wanted to make sure our poppet valves weren't leaking, and we were dripping fuel that way. But they're all still closed. So our poppet valves are not leaking. The fuel pressure regulator is not leaking. We're not leaking around any of the fittings over here. We see no signs of where it's leaking. This is the bottom of the intake. If you go over here and look at the top of the intake, you can see that air is actually being drawn in through here. That air goes into these channels and comes right here. Now you can see how this is actually lower than these, so your intake gasket seals this, but these are lower. So the air that comes into here and enters the inner intake, and it expands all the way around there. So the air that actually comes through here then circulates inside this intake, and it goes down in these channels, which then come out here and go down into the engine. So this whole area, this whole intake here, is under vacuum. When your throttle plate opens, vacuum comes into this whole thing. It circulates around here and it goes down into the intake ports. So if you run into this condition, you're probably going to be like us, and you're going to look for some type of a leak where you can actually see it leaking. We're suspicious that the fuel pressure regulator might be leaking. Here's a way to test that. If you just get you an air gun, now if you notice on the fuel pressure regulator, there is a hole right there. If you take your air gun, don't get it real close, but just blow some air in there. Now one precaution here, there is a diaphragm in here, so don't take your gun and put it right up against that hole and blow it. Keep your gun back a few inches and then you can blow it this way. You can see when we're blowing air in there that it is actually drawing fuel through there and leaking. Now that fuel is not dripping. Even though we have fuel pressure, it's not dripping out and pooling down here. But when the engine is running and this is full of vacuum, it is actually coming out as a mist and being put down into the intake that way. Now that is unmetered fuel. It's actually going into the cylinders and it is actually making the engine run very, very rich. Now what we're going to do here is change the fuel pressure regulator and do this same test like this. So that you can see what the new pressure regulator is supposed to look like. You want to make sure that you get that old O-ring out of there. It goes right on the very end. And then the new regulator should have a new one, a new O-ring. Make sure you get that O-ring out of there. Make sure both O-rings, the internal one and the outer one, are there, and put just a little bit of grease on them to make them slip in okay. Now you can see when we took that out of there, we actually lost our fuel pressure. We're reading 0 now, so we're going to go turn the key on and repressurize our unit. Cycle the key a couple times to get that fuel line full. Now we're going to come back and repeat that test with the air gun. Now when you took that fuel pressure regulator out, it leaked fuel all over the bottom of the intake. So take a rag or something and kind of dab that up, because when you blow this air in here again, you don't want that fuel spraying all over the place. Now we should be able to take our air gun and blow it into that hole in the pressure regulator. And you see it's not leaking at all. So this fuel pressure regulator was leaking, and that mist of fuel was coming out and going into the intake. Now another thing what you want to do while you have your air gun here, we took the poppet valves out. We need to go ahead and spray down there in case any fuel went down inside there. Spray down all the poppet. Get it all blown out, and then we need to put our poppet valves back in place. Now these are can get brittle, so make sure they actually will snap down into their tube hole and stay in place. If they won't stay down, you probably have to replace them. Then we just need to clean off our surface, put a new intake gasket on it, put it back together.